It's my pleasure to introduce Jeff Hardy, our speaker today, who was an associate professor in the Department of History here at BYU. Jeff was an undergraduate here at BYU. In fact, graduated from the Kennedy Center, right? In a degree that we no longer offer, unfortunately. International studies, international relations is adjacent to that, certainly. But he also earned a master's in history from BYU and then a PhD also in history from Princeton University. He has taught here at BYU since 2011, and he has focused his research on the Gulag, that is, the penal system of the Soviet Union. He became interested in this topic while he served as a missionary in Magadan, Russia, which is a city on Russia's eastern Asian coast, and which was actually a major transit center for political prisoners during the Soviet Union. He's the author of many articles, books, reviews, book chapters. Well, one important book so far, The Gulag After Stalin, Redefining Punishment in Khrushchev's Soviet Union. And he's also nearing completion of another study entitled Finding God in the Gulag, A Religious History of the Soviet Penal System. And it's from this project, I'm guessing, that this presentation today comes from. So please join me in welcoming Professor Hardy to the Kennedy Center.
Thank you, Stan. Thank you all so much for being here on this Valentine's Day, also Ash Wednesday. We have a couple of important holidays to celebrate, religious and otherwise. And so I appreciate the time that you've taken out of your day to be with us. The Kennedy Center theme for the semester, authoritarianism and its discontents, is quite literally what I've been studying my entire academic career, so this seems quite perfect. As Stan mentioned, I study prisons and concentration camps in the Soviet Union. The Gulag is the acronym by which this system is known, and you can see the location of many of the Gulag camps on this map, literally all over the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was, at its core, a repressive country. This is one of its defining features, in my view, along with a complete lack of democratic participation by ordinary citizens. Vladimir Lenin, when he seized power, along with his Karl Marx-inspired Bolsheviks in 1917, seized it in the name of the people. They said that they're creating a socialist state led by the dictatorship of the proletariat. And they never give up on this rhetoric about being a dictatorship acting in the name of the working class, the proletariat. Nor do they ever give up on this dream of creating a socioeconomic socialist system that would, in theory, in some far-off future, morph into communism. So without question, this is an authoritarian regime, certainly under Lenin, even more so under Stalin. Now, as you probably know already, this authoritarian regime produces a lot of discontent. Actually, one of the more surprising things to me is that the Soviet Union produces a lot of passionate support, both inside and outside of the USSR. Marxist ideology is, well, I mean, it's a lot of things, but it is really appealing, it turns out, to a lot of people, disadvantaged people in particular, the working class, but also to an array of intellectuals and dreamers, people who genuinely saw this as a way of improving human society, of alleviating poverty, of providing an antidote to the rapacious greed and exploitation of capitalism and imperialism. But we're not talking about that today. We're talking about all the people who hated the Bolsheviks for various reasons. Some think that Lenin and Stalin are too authoritarian, even if they, are socialist at heart. Some chafe at various opportunists who kind of cling on to this regime, pretending to be true believers. Some just really don't like the ideology, particularly those from the wealthier classes of society who are directly threatened by it. And some rejected the Soviet regime and Marxist ideology because of direct attacks that it makes on various aspects of traditional life, including, for our purposes today, religion. Marx famously called religion the opiate of the masses. Lenin sought to destroy the Russian Orthodox Church and other ecclesiastical structures in the Soviet Union, while also promoting propaganda and educational programs bent on convincing Soviet citizens to abandon religious belief as a bundle of superstitions, utilized by the exploiting classes to keep the masses subservient. So we can see an Orthodox cathedral here in Moscow being blown up, some nice anti-religious propaganda there on the right. Although it should be noted that Lenin, in the first Soviet constitution, and this is perpetuated in subsequent Soviet constitutions, provided guarantees for the free exercise of religious conscience in the country. So there's this tension that persists throughout the Soviet Union's existence, where religion is never illegal. In fact, it's protected by law. And yet, the Soviet regime ends up killing, imprisoning, exile, and harassing all sorts of religious believers for their religious beliefs. So this tension is something that just never goes away. And those, of course, to go back to the theme for our semester, who are repressed in various ways, are discontented by this situation. My book coming out this October with Oxford University Press centers on the life of imprisoned Christians in the Gulag. And so I hope that some of you might have a chance to read that. I look at a variety of Christians from the Orthodox, Catholic, Lutheran, other Christian traditions, Jehovah's Witnesses, Adventists, and how they sought out and created a sense of spiritual life and community while imprisoned in this very institution that was trying to rob them of their beliefs. So I think it's a very poignant story. We see images here of priests, of a Lutheran Mass being celebrated in one of the mines, a vest with religious inscriptions on the inside to hide it from the guards, an icon that was embroidered in the Gulag here. But today, I'm not talking about that. I'll be talking about Jews, which, by the way, is something that I know very little about. This is kind of my first foray into the study of Judaism, so bear with me if I get some things wrong. I will work to correct my lack of knowledge in the coming months. So, a preliminary for me talk. Prior to its collapse in 1917, the Russian Empire is home to millions of Jews, more than any other country in the world. Jews in this time period, though late imperial period, late 1800s, early 1900s, are increasingly leaving. They're leaving for the United States, they're leaving for Palestine in smaller numbers. They're fleeing anti-Semitism, they're seeking out economic opportunity. They're also inspired by this ideology of Zionism, this desire to recreate a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So we see Jews moving out of Europe, including the Russian Empire, and attempting to go to Palestine. Now, when the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, we see some Jews being targeted for their class status, for their opposition to Marxism, but we see many other Jews participating or applauding the revolution, encouraged by Bolshevik promises that there would be this brotherhood of nations, where all ethnic groups, Jews included, would be treated equally. They would be allowed, even encouraged, to develop their own sense of ethnic identity, and we see some Soviet propaganda along these lines, this idea that you Jews are part of us, right? You belong here in the Soviet Union. In fact, many leading Bolsheviks were, in fact, Jews. And here we should remember that Jews are an incredibly diverse group. They spoke different languages, they varied widely in religious devotion, many are not religious at all. They varied widely in terms of professional, educational level. Now, Soviet promises of equal treatment toward Jews kind of hold through the 1920s and into the 1930s, but to cut to the chase, there's a marked increase in anti-Semitism coming from the very top, Stalin and state structures, right around World War II, kind of right before World War II and then through the war and afterwards, which is the time period I'll focus on today. And when Stalin unleashes this wave of anti-Semitism, which includes arrests and executions of prominent Jewish figures, alongside other ethnic and religious groups, we see very kind of long-standing entrenched anti-Semitic beliefs that had been for a few decades taboo and polite conversation in the Soviet Union, now surfacing. So this is the stage for our story. This sudden increase in anti-Jewish persecution in the late 1930s, 1940s, into the 1950s that results in tens of thousands of them ending up in the Gulag, this system of camps and prisons that was supposed to isolate criminals and enemies of the regime, turn them into good Soviet citizens, all while forcing them to labor in some of the most inhospitable places of the Soviet Union. So the remainder of my talk then, coming from a paper that I hope to publish at some point this year, next year, I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, the participation of some undergraduate student researchers who helped me perform some of my research, think through some of these issues: Haley Steinagel, Avery Baxter, Ben Campbell, Georgia Collings, Phoebe England, Alex Mulder, Katie Truman, and Sam Watson. Thank you. I see some of them in the back now. There they are, waving their hands. Great job, guys. I appreciate you being here. In the Gulag camp of Gulag in Central Asia, Jewish inmate Zvi Pregerson started his mornings with a daily walk, during which he found time and privacy to sing and to pray. As he related, I sang Hebrew songs, Yiddish songs, and Jewish melodies without words. Over the years, I assembled more than 100 songs, so I divided them between the days of the week. Every day I sang different songs, including the Shabbat songs. Jewish life, it seems, thrived, at least in this very small corner of the Gulag. In a Soviet prison hundreds of miles away, however, Yehoshua Joboa, sorry I don't have a picture of him, lay awake during the middle of the night, taking turns with a fellow Jewish inmate. Watching for trouble. Sorry, the students of mine know that I can get a little emotional talking about things like this. They were, as he related, the only Jews in the cell, and there was an anti-Semitic Pole in with us who suddenly lost all control of himself, began threatening that he would strangle us in our sleep. The whole war, he cried, World War II, had broken out only on account of the Jews. Now, Joboa survived that night without incident, but his fear of anti-Semitic violence never dissipated as long as he was imprisoned in the Soviet Gulag. So what did it mean to be Jewish in the Gulag? Was there a uniquely Jewish experience? As these two brief anecdotes illustrate, this isn't an easy question to answer. As many scholars of the Gulag have discovered, the experience of being imprisoned varied widely. Age, gender, ethnicity, religion, sentence length, conviction statute, year, camp location, the disposition of local commanders and guards, and many other factors produced a wide range of experiences. Second, Jewish inmates themselves were a diverse lot, including committed communists, secular intellectuals, Zionists, and rabbis, to say nothing of myriad complex personalities. And finally, attitudes toward Jews similarly ranged widely. And what this paper explores, therefore, is this diversity of Jewish experience. It'll be broken up into 4 sections, focusing on relationships with guards and then other prisoners, the development of a Jewish cultural community in the Gulag, and then this idea of a spiritual relationship with God, which I'll explore last. So, guards. In the uncompromising political climate of the war and post-war years, guards and administrators in the Soviet Gulag often displayed openly anti-Semitic attitudes towards Jewish inmates. Such officials were already predisposed to treating inmates poorly. Memoirs contain endless accounts of physical and verbal abuse meted out against prisoners for any number of reasons, and a Jewish name or outward markers of Jewish identity could easily compound such treatment, though this varied from camp to camp. There's lots of examples of this. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this section. Suffice it to say that this is happening. Some guards, though, and this is what I find somewhat interesting, went out of their way to treat Jews kindly. One of the most common manifestations of this was Gulag administrators employing Jews according to their economic specialty, their vocational specialty, which very importantly kept them off the hard general labor that proved so deadly to so many inmates of the Gulag. Many Jewish medical professionals, for instance, benefited from this, being able to work as a doctor. Yehoshua Gilboa described how a group of Jewish actors were relieved of general labor felling trees in order to work full-time as actors in the camp's cultural educational department. He also remembered that the camp director quickly learned that there was a tree expert among the Jewish inmates who could, quote, tell the age and quality of a tree by sight and was able to give a nearly accurate estimate of the number of cubic meters of timber it would provide. And this then he's able to work as an administrator rather than with axe in hand, a job that can be quite fatal in the conditions of the Gulag. Now, without doubt, these Gulag officials are seeking to increase the economic production of their camps, which is their most important task. Their motivation, in other words, is not altruistic. As Gilboa concluded of one official, though the sentiment is much more broadly applicable, he used the Jews because they helped him. But these guards' willingness to admit Jews into positions of authority in the camp, which came with better living and working conditions, still means that anti-Semitic impulses receded when economic benefit was at stake. Some support from guards, however, was based not on this quid pro quo calculation, but on a sense of shared ethnicity. A number of guards and administrators in the Gulag were Jewish themselves, and this creates a very interesting dynamic in the camps. Jews speak in their memoirs of how some of them would seek out Jewish inmates and talk with them and provide assistance in terms of food or medicine or just some time off work. This was typically done in secret. They don't want anyone to find out that they're providing this support. Yehoshua Gilboa records the story of a Jewish official who visited his camp. He wrote, "This big shot came into the room where many Jews used to congregate. And the Jews immediately were fearful of him, that he was going to get them in trouble. But he immediately dispelled our suspicions," Gilboa wrote. "A living, broken Jewish spirit was hidden under his uniform." And he and the inmates then spoke for hours. The prisoners, as described by Gilboa, lit up as they spoke with him, as their conversation turned to memories of days not too far in the past, about Jewish life in the countries we came from and about Palestine. So these are some really interesting, poignant, somewhat exceptional, but not wholly experiences that Jews are discovering in the Soviet Gulag. Okay, other inmates. Non-Jewish inmates display a similar variety of treatment vis-a-vis their Jewish counterparts. Among those who treated Jews the worst were the infamous thieves-in-law, a gang that terrorized other inmates in various ways. A gang that relied on Russian ethno-nationalism to justify bigotry against various minority groups. Menachem Begin, who later becomes Prime Minister of Israel, as a side note, recalled one gang boss taunting him and another Jewish inmate with a familiar slur, Yid, while also making light of their escape from the Nazis, only to end up in the camps of the Soviets. Stanislav Svianevich, a Polish prisoner, confirmed of the thieves-in-law, they never missed an opportunity to pester or mock their Jewish fellow inmates. For me, one of the most interesting aspects of this anti-Semitism that we find among the Gulag gangs is in their tattooing. These gangsters employed a wide range of tattoos for various purposes. Some of it displays Russian Orthodox or Russian nationalist symbology. The negative counterpart of that is that many of these tattoos display imagery that is actively hostile against various non-Russian ethnic groups or religious groups. Along with communist officials, Jews are the most common target, and I apologize in advance. A few of these images are going to be a little rough. Anti-Semitic tattoos commonly depicted devilish figures with pronounced noses, beady eyes, horns, fangs, pointed ears, cloven hooves, the Star of David, all features used in traditional anti-Semitic imagery. In some of these images, we see the figures embracing or more disturbingly raping Russian women, another traditional trope used to spark anti-Semitic violence. Many anti-Semitic tattoos also contain imagery linking Jews to the Soviet regime. The one on the left, for example, a Jewish devil figure with a necklace around his neck bearing the acronym KPSS, Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and in the midst of that you see the Star of David, and around it you see skulls and crossbones, you see the hammer and sickle, and on the skulls you see written the names of some of the camps of the Gulag. Some other ones, similar images here. I don't think I need to describe these in detail. The one in the middle has the figure on his forehead. It says the landlord of the Gulag, or the boss of the Gulag, essentially. These direct associations between Jews and communism were commonly found in Nazi Germany, interwar Poland, and other East European countries, and they're adopted by Russian nationalists as well. Associating Jewish inmates with Gulag bosses and other Soviet officials marks those inmates for abuse. More surprisingly, I've found there's a lot of Nazi imagery actually used in these anti-Semitic tattoos. Given the loose association of the thieves-in-law with Russian nationalist ideology, this is a bit surprising. But these are not used to express any sort of like German nationalism or devotion to fascism, but rather to explicitly profess admiration for Nazi efforts to exterminate European Jewry. You can see an example of this on the left with the Nazi officer beheading a Jew who has both the Star of David and the hammer and sickle on his uniform. The one on the right, actually not from the thieves-in-law, but from a Ukrainian gangster who equates Jews to rats, essentially equating communism with Judaism, and you can see the Heil Hitler and the swastika there. Such tattoos conveyed the fierce anti-Semitism that thrived among Gulag gangs, but anti-Semitism flourished among lots of different Gulag prisoners from a range of ethnic and religious backgrounds. Vladimir Kabo, a non-religious Jewish inmate, related how he became acquainted with a Catholic priest trained as a Jesuit in Rome, an intelligent man that Kabo enjoyed conversing with until he discovered the depths of this man's anti-Semitism, such as when he asserted nonchalantly that Jews are parasites on the artistic achievements of other people. Michael Solomon describes similar attitudes in a camp in Magadan that held many Ukrainians and Germans. Although some were decent fellows, he wrote, not a few individuals were nearly always anti-Semitic in their relations with us. Janusz Bardak and others found strong anti-Semitism from their fellow Poles. Bardak is a Polish Jew. What a shock to be in the same barracks with the very people who had encouraged anti-Semitism in Poland, even before the Nazis arrived, he recalled. As one told him outright, the first step toward the destruction of our country, Poland, was giving equal rights to Jews. We were far too tolerant of their scheming and cronyism. So this is just the casual conversations that Jewish inmates are hearing on a daily basis among their fellow inmates. Bardak, in fact, grew so tired of this that he got himself transferred out of the Polish sector of the camp, even though he considered himself very much Polish. He simply couldn't tolerate this incessant anti-Semitic rhetoric. Most Jews suffered this abuse passively. After all, they comprise a small minority in the camps. What are you going to do? They know they can't turn to guards or administrators for help. We have a few accounts of Jews trying to stand up for themselves. Zvi Pregerzin writes of a friend of his, Sasha Sucher, a withdrawn, bespectacled Jewish intellectual. He recalled when one of the prisoners, who was much stronger, insulted him as a Jew, this quiet guy immediately began fighting. I don't remember the outcome of the fight, but the very fact that he chose to fight says a lot about Sasha. Another one did the same thing and was badly beaten. The marks of this fight, Pregerzin recalled, remained on his face, but he carried them with pride. But many inmates, on the other hand, treated their Jewish counterparts indifferently or even benevolently. Simeon Badash related how inmates at the Akipastush camp in 1951 formed this underground camp council, and they invited representatives from various ethnic groups, including the Jews whom he represented. And he says that while there he felt this camaraderie based on a mutual hatred for the Soviets that superseded any ethnic tension among the prisoners. And he took the opportunity to relate to the council the eternal persecution of the Jewish people, starting from the exodus out of Egyptian slavery, through the medieval Inquisition, and ending with communist anti-Semitism and the struggle against Zionism. He says his counterparts listened attentively and respectfully. And he felt that this educational opportunity among those previously prejudiced against the Jewish people was beginning to dissipate. The prison setting meant that people were forced to live and work and eat with their Jewish counterparts, an experience that many had lacked before. Some even forged friendships across this potential dividing line. Olga Adamova-Slozberg, for example, took Olya Kostenko, a newly arrived prisoner from Kyiv, under her wing, providing warmth, food, friendship, before then discovering the depths of her traditional anti-Semitic beliefs. She wrote, "I could have shortened these painful conversations by saying that I myself was a Jew." She was hiding her identity, as did many Jews in the camps, seeking to avoid the abuse that they faced. But then this foolish girl couldn't have stayed with me. She would freeze and starve without the food and blanket sent to me by my Jewish relatives. But after just 2 weeks, Adama Slozberg is transferred to another camp, forced to leave her young counterpart. Before doing so, she confessed, "I'm Jewish," to her friend Olya. And in the memoir, she writes that Olya then cried and threw herself on my neck and stated, "You've taught me such a lesson. Forgive me. I swear I will always remember it." So the Gulag provides this really unique opportunity for Olya to experience a very intimate relationship with a Jewish prisoner, allows her to unlearn some of those anti-Semitic beliefs that had been ingrained in her since childhood. Amid the daily quest to survive the Gulag, and this was a struggle, millions of people died in the Gulag. Jewish inmates often sought out fellow Jews to gain a sense of community. They banded together for physical protection, resource sharing, keeping spirits alive. Other groups are doing this as well, of course. Some Jews found it possible to use their positions in the camp to help their Jewish counterparts. Pregerzin remembered one, worked in the medical department, helped Jewish prisoners get released from work or have their workload lightened. Another inmate likewise recalled a Jewish inmate who worked at the manager in the sewing workshop in their camp, who always selected other Jews to work there rather than felling trees. He was especially attentive to a couple of rabbis in the camp, allowing them to pray all day in the workshop rather than work at all. One inmate who was fortunate to be surrounded by an unusually large and diverse Jewish community in the Gulag was Moshe Privs. Most of these, he's observed, did not pray regularly or keep the Sabbath distinct from the other days, but they spoke Yiddish among themselves. They observed the traditional holidays as best they could. They organized an underground Hebrew club that met bi-weekly under the direction of a Jewish scholar. None of us ever dared write anything down. He wrote of the songs and poems that they learned by heart. But after much repetition, all of the regulars recited the material by heart. It was tremendously moving, he writes, to gather in the dark and in hushed tones recite a Zionist poem. Even among those who did not attend these Hebrew Club meetings, a robust system of mutual support developed. We learned quickly how to get along under trying circumstances, to depend on each other. If one took ill, he was tended. If he couldn't get something he absolutely needed, someone would provide it. If he couldn't walk, the other Jews would pull him along. We see this similar in the memoir of Zvi Pregerzin. Speaking of his daily life in the Gulag, he wrote, "I read fiction, had my morning and evening walks. I spoke Hebrew with Ba'azov and sang Hebrew songs with Yehezel Pularevich. I also spent time with other friends, among them Meir Gelfond, who asked Pregerzin to teach him Hebrew. In another camp, a fellow inmate asked him to learn Yiddish with his help. And here, as in his previous camp, as he recalled, many meetings with my Jewish friends occurred during the evening hours while we walked along Jewish Street, a path in the camp that they gave that name to it themselves." Menachem Begin recalled how an older Jewish inmate, I'm going to skip one of these, despairing late one night that he would die in the camps at the hands of the criminal gangs, requested in Yiddish that Begin sing the Hativka, the Zionist anthem that was then adopted as the national anthem of Israel. This is notable because the man, Mikhail Garin, was a former official of the Communist Party, an editor for Pravda, the party newspaper. And he had never spoken Yiddish in the camps before. Stunned but compassionate, Begin complied. He wrote, "Together with Marmelstein, I began to sing Hativka. 3 other Jews lying near us joined in. I felt as if we were saying the confessional prayer with a Jew who, like a kidnapped child, had pastured in strange fields. And on the threshold of death, after many tribulations, returns to his people and to his faith." It was an emotional scene, complete with thieves-in-law gangsters mocking them as they sang. But for Begin, this is a sacred moment of Jewish camaraderie. As he wrote, "Out of the depths we cried unto the Lord, Lashuv le'eretz avotenu, to return to the land of our forefathers." Okay, checking the time here. Sorry, we're going to skip Vogelfanger and his account of Passover in the Gulag. Last one. Personal relationships with God in the Gulag. Certainly not all Jews are religious in the Gulag, but those who are, many of them tried to maintain this sense of religious belief and devotion amidst anti-religious repression coming from both guards and other prisoners. Scriptures and other writings are forbidden, confiscated. Gulag officials periodically gave anti-religious lectures to the inmates. Yet believers of many faiths, including Judaism, resisted such attempts to regulate their inner spiritual lives. One of the most essential connecting points between man and deity in Judaism is Sabbath observance, which is very difficult in the Gulag because the Jewish Sabbath was simply another working day. But some attempted to keep Sabbath traditions alive as best they could. The Jewish prisoner Reb Mordecai, who worked as an accountant in his camp, found a way to keep the Sabbath day holy, where he would sit at his desk and play with his abacus, but not actually do any work. He would pretend to work. Observing kosher regulations, another way for devout Jewish prisoners to embrace their identity, but also very, very difficult to do in the Gulag, and most simply found that they couldn't manage. The same inmate, Reb Mordecai, reported to have only eaten kosher food. He tried really hard. He would eat the bread supplied by the camp, considering that close enough to kosher, and then he would make his own barley soup, along with the little kosher food that he received in packages from his family. Daily prayers could likewise be difficult, but many Jewish inmates managed to continue this practice in the quiet of the barracks or elsewhere in the camp zone. Yuri Yurkevich observed of his Jewish cellmate, Moisei Shur, that every day he devotedly prayed for a long time while wearing a black yarmulke, sitting to the side and rocking back and forth. This he did regardless of how many inmates could see or hear him. Gilboa wrote of a work partner who, while working together to saw logs, would take the side of the saw that faced east so that he could pray in accordance with Judaic law, and would offer the words, "Hear our voice, Lord our God, spare us and have pity on us, accept our prayer in mercy and in favor." Finding evidence of God's concern for them was one of the primary ways in which Jewish inmates clung to their faith amid stark trials. Michael Solomon, interpreted a chance encounter with the brother of one of his childhood friends who was in a position to grant him a needed stay in the hospital to recover his strength as an unmistakable miracle. "Did not God Almighty wish to spare my life?" he wrote. He also interpreted various hardships through a spiritual lens. Oppressed by slave labor as he saw it in the far reaches of northeastern Russia, he recalled the words I knew from childhood, telling the story of the plight of the Jews in Egypt, and starting with the line, "We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt," this familiar story to all Jews. Isaac Vogelfanger rarely met other Jews in the Severalski camp where he was imprisoned during and after the war, but occasionally found the time to think about, to praise God. He interpreted a kind nurse who saved his life in the hospital as evidence of God's help. He also found God in the proverbial wilderness. Once he saw the aurora borealis on a cold winter night and interpreted it as, quote, a heavenly image of the Almighty. It was as if he were saying, "This is the signature of my presence, which is eternal." On another occasion in the forest, he described experiencing, quote, a rare intimacy with God, the one only approachable through prayer. Tears of happiness rolled down my cheeks. Driven involuntarily by an inner power, I said in a loud voice, "Hear, my people, our God is the only God." An immense silence reigned. I was mesmerized and able to depart now from this consecrated place that had assumed the sanctity of a temple. This connection between God and the natural environment that surrounded the camps was also noted by Yehoshua Gilboa. While tasked with felling trees along with other Jewish prisoners, he observed how some of these starving inmates, quote, enlisted the trees in a secret pact with the Almighty and took advantage of the hours of slavery beside thick trunks to be alone with their Creator and whisper a prayer to Him. None were permitted prayer shawls, phylacteries, or prayer books, and it was difficult to murmur a petition to God in the muddy hut. But in the forest, the wall between a Jew and his Creator vanished. Now, not all Jews found inner spiritual peace in the maelstrom of the Gulag. Gilboa encountered a man who had previously been a Talmudic scholar before abandoning religion to join the Polish Communist Party. In the camps, he was generous with his knowledge of Scripture, but never returned to the faith. Similarly, the secular Polish Jew Janusz Bardak at one point lay very sick in the camp hospital and pondered his possible impending death. Maybe God was punishing me, he wondered, because I never believed in Him. I never invoked His help, His mercy. But ultimately, Bardak concluded that this couldn't be true. I saw too many terrible things. To believe that God existed. I felt lost and abandoned. There was nothing in this world that could save me. Bardak survived this episode, but neither this nor anything else in the camps drew him back to his family's ancestral faith. So to briefly conclude then, the Gulag, it's this place of suffering, of death, of intense contradictions, of life, of culture, of spirituality. It's a place of intense anti-Semitism, but also vibrant Jewish cultural and religious life. Jews were beaten and verbally abused and even attacked in the tattoo symbology of Gulag gangs, yet they also found friends and allies among administrators, guards, and fellow inmates. They communed with each other. They taught each other Hebrew and Yiddish. They discussed Zionism. They rejoiced when Israel is created. They attempted to abide by commandments regulating the Sabbath, daily prayer, kosher eating. For some, their ethnic and religious identities condemn them to violence and death. But for others, their Jewishness provided salvation in the human meat grinder of the Gulag. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was really engaging, very moving as well. We do have some time for some questions. What we'll do is we'll just ask you, if you have a question, please raise your hand. Jeff will call on you. We'll have them, but wait for the microphone. We have one of our students will bring a microphone around to you, and please tell us who you are, what you're studying, if you're a student, and ask your question. Some of you may need to leave for a 1 o'clock class, and that's fine. Please do so as quietly as we can, and we'll go until 1 p.m. So, please.
Hello, my name is Joseph. I'm studying
Joseph.
information systems here at BYU, and I was curious with the relationship between Jewish members of these camps was there much evidence of Jewish Jewish people kind of throwing each other under the bus or backbiting, or is it largely seen as trying to stick together to survive those circumstances?
I would say more of the latter, less of the former, but that's definitely happening. Yeah, there's a lot of different axes on which Jewish society is split. Religious, non-religious, intellectual, non-religious, or non-intellectual, Zionist, anti-Zionist. Actually, Zionism is one of the big points of contention within this Jewish society. Many Jews don't buy into this idea of Jewish nationalism that should result in the creation of a state of Israel. They interpreted the plight of Jews in the world a bit differently in terms of what they should do about it. And so, yeah, there's some really intense discussions about that. Jewish communists who retain their belief in communism in the camps are described in a number of memoirs as working as informants both against their fellow Jews and other inmates as well. So, throwing people under the bus. All right, and this is the most, this is the clearest way that can be done in the Gulag, is serving as an internal informant, a stool pigeon, if you will. Jewish society is quite complex. It's riven with these tensions, and that persists in the Gulag. I didn't speak much of that in the presentation today, so thank you for asking that question. But yeah, not everything is happy in the Jewish society. Yeah, there's some intense debates and disagreements that are happening too. Got one over here.
Hi, my name is Valerie. I'm studying Japanese here at BYU. And I was wondering, so in World War II, Russia was on our side, and we worked with them.
Correct.
And so, from the Russian government's perspective, or just the Russian people's perspective, I guess, what were their stakes in the war, and how did they feel about the fact that we were, in a way, helping Jews, since there was a lot of anti-Semitism going on within
that the war
Russia?
ended up doing what to Jews?
That, in Nazi Germany, the Jews were being persecuted.
Right.
So,
okay.
By fighting Germany,
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't the only goal in fighting Germany, but we did help the Jews in that way. How did Russians feel about that, particularly anti-Semitic ones?
Good. Thank you for that question. Really good question. So Russia's stakes in the war are pretty simple. Nazi Germany invades and attempts to conquer the country. So the stakes for the Soviet Union, for Russians, are defending their homeland. I mean, at root, that's the basis of it. Now, this is really curious. The relationship between kind of Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and the Jewish population that is quite literally cut in the middle. So when the invasion of Poland, for example, happens, Nazi Germany invades Poland from the west, the Soviet Union invades Poland from the east, we find a lot of Jews in the western part of the country trying to flee into the Soviet zone of occupation because they think that the Soviet treatment of Jews will be better. And yes, it is. The Soviet Union does not perpetrate the Holocaust. The Nazis do. But they don't know that this is kind of that moment when the climate in the Soviet Union is turning against Jews. And there's been a lot written about this. Why does Stalin suddenly make this shift? And there's been different theories stemming from other high-ranking Bolsheviks who were Jewish that he is attacking in the 1930s as he's consolidating his dictatorship. This influx of Jews from the West, though, fleeing Nazi occupation, to many Russians and other Slavic peoples in the region, raises long-seated fears of a Jewish takeover, one that is in combination with the Communist Party. So it's this really weird situation where the Communist Party itself under Stalin is becoming anti-Semitic, and yet the Russian people, many of them, are viewing Jews as allied with the Communist Party. And so, I don't know, it's hard to fully describe all the complexities involved here, but the Jews are feeling persecution from all sides. Stalin is especially hard against Zionism, seeing that Zionism is an ideology that is going to serve to potentially break up the Soviet Union. So this is complicated, but in the Soviet Union, nationalism is good, but some forms of nationalism are bad. So we promote Ukrainian nationalism sometimes, but if it seems like the Ukrainians are getting too nationalistic, then that's going to be repressed. And the same thing with Judaism. There's a sense, we think, by Stalin that the Jews are becoming too political, too national in their thinking, and so they need to be, repressed for that reason. Hope that answers that question. Yeah.
My name's Trent. I'm studying experience design and management here, and I was wondering if, while living in the Gulag, a lot of these Jews were able to start families and how the conditions were for their children.
Ooh, wow. Okay, interesting question. So in the Gulag, as in most prison systems at this time, conjugal relations are forbidden. But it turns out there's a lot of sex happening in the Gulag. Men and women finding ways, both out of attraction or love, thanks Valentine's Day, made an appearance suddenly, also out of coercion. Rape, quite prevalent in the Gulag. So it's difficult. As for families, women in the Gulag who bear children have their children at a very young age taken from them, sent to orphanages throughout the Soviet Union. So the short answer is, like a family, as we think of a family, almost impossible. Our babies being born, yeah, but not in good circumstances that would lend themselves to any sort of family life. So, in the memoirs that I've consulted, I've found almost no references to this. But that's not uncommon. Most memoirists don't talk about things like that. It's pretty hard to find, actually. It's one of these taboo topics. Yeah, let's see.
Leslie Hadfield in the history department. So this last statement you made goes with my question, and that is, how did you find all of this information? What were your sources, and which ones were the best ones that you found?
Great question on sources. So when I first started working on religion in the Gulag, I was thinking of my book project as being about Christianity and Islam and Judaism, and so I began collecting materials on all three. Now, the book ended up just being about Christianity, but I had all this other stuff that is now this paper and maybe some other things. What I found is that in the official Gulag documents, so I've been to Moscow, I've read the Gulag files, they almost never mention Jews as a distinct group of people in the Gulag. We find Christians and Muslims somewhat. Jews are almost completely absent. So I don't have those sources. It's like they wanted to simply ignore them, pretend like there isn't this subset of people, Jews in the Gulag. So almost everything in here is from memoirs written by both Jewish and non-Jewish prisoners. I still have a lot more memoirs to go through, and so this is preliminary. But yeah, that's mostly my sources, is memoirs and a few letters, and then obviously the tattoos that were collected.
My name is Nate. I'm studying political science. I'm just curious what the legacy of this is in Russia today and in the other formerly Soviet states.
in short, the legacy is that there are massive waves of Jewish outmigration in the 1970s and 1990s, where most Jews who were, for the most part, prevented from leaving the Soviet Union during most of its existence are able to get out, and they get out. And Israel is the destination for many of them. A very large percentage of the population in Israel speaks Russian because that's where they come from. And so that's one of the legacies of this repression that I'm talking about. And some of these memoirs that I'm reading are published in Israel because that's where these people end up. But yeah, a sense at the beginning of the Soviet Union that this can be a place of safety for us, which then turns into a realization in the 1940s, 50s, and this anti-Semitism continues throughout the rest of the Soviet Union, that this is not a place of safety, that we need to emigrate to Israel, the United States, Germany perhaps, a few other places that would be safe. Germany after the Nazis. So yeah, that's one of the big legacies.
My name is Paige. I'm an international relations major. I was just wondering, what's your takeaway from this? Why study these stories? What message do you hope that we can take away from this?
Yeah, the takeaway, why study it? So as a historian, I'm fascinated by like everything in the past, but these stories, particularly at BYU, I think resonate, right? As we are interested in wedding scholarship and faith, being able to study how this particular faith group endures persecution, how they think about it, how they interpret it, how they turn to God or turn away from God. I think these stories are ones that can be deeply meaningful for us as scholars of faith, essentially, at more than just an academic level. And maybe that's why I get emotional about this stuff. The stories touch me very deeply.